All right. Good morning. Welcome everyone to pharmacology. Glad to have you all on board. So we will get through a little bit of housekeeping before we go, just to update you all on the final exam. Everybody has completed the final exam. So what I need to do is I need to go in, take a look at it, and do some analytics. And then we can review it a little bit, or review the questions that gave people the hardest time. That is a significant number or portion of the class got wrong, and have some discussion about those. And so the grades are gonna shift around a little bit. So I have not put anything into the grade book yet. I did get some messages. People were concerned about that. And I just, until we know what you officially got on the final exam, I'm not going to put anything in the grade book. So it'll just, I won't have a grade for now. And then once we get that all sorted out, and you know what your official grade is on the final exam, that'll go in the book, and then you'll have your final course grade there in Canvas. Now official grades won't get posted until after the end of semester, after May, but at least you'll know what you're doing ahead of time, regardless. Let's see, I was having trouble. Dakota. Let me take a look here, Dakota. I thought everybody had turned in all the assignments. Let me take a look here. Lifespan. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, I see it here. It looks like yeah, you uploaded a file, lifespan and dev complete.pdf. Yeah, did you get my message? I sent you a message on that saying that what the file you uploaded was completely blank. So it was just a blank chapter, but nothing had been filled out, and then I reassigned it to you. So you should be able to go back in, and what you can do is just lay out all of the 4 or 5 pages, and just take a quick picture of them, and then send the JPEG file through. You may have to email it to me because the course technically closed yesterday, so it may not allow you to send an assignment through. So do that and see if it works. And just as a reminder, if you need to get a hold of me and you want to have an expectation of me responding to you in a reasonable time, remember, use my NMSU email. The messaging through Canvas, because I have been getting lots of email through Canvas. If I am not literally logged into Canvas and actively engaged, I do not receive those. So if I'm not literally working in Canvas, I may not get that message. Whereas if I get an email to my NMSU email account, that gets pushed to my phone, my iPad, my computer, whatever. And so I get those much faster, and I'm able to respond to you all in a much more reasonable period of time. And so just a reminder there, you're more than welcome to use messaging through Canvas if you're not in a big hurry, if you don't need me to urgently respond to something, but just remember there may be delays there. All right, so before we get going into pharmacology, are there any other questions? All right, good deal. Okay, so just as a heads up regarding tomorrow, we will lecture in the morning, and then we will meet up at the college, the East Mesa campus, in the afternoon. in the Doñana Student Resources Building, or the DASR building. That is the large building toward the east, the far east aspect of the campus. And then there's that big parking lot, and there's a DASR building there. And there are those big double doors that you can go through, the big windowed area, and it goes into that commons area. And that's where we will meet up for lab tomorrow. Lab will run from 14:30 to about 1700. It may go a little later than that if we have to. Although, let's see, tomorrow is Thursday, so we can actually go a little later. There are some days of the week, like Tuesdays, where the EMT classes come in for labs in the late afternoon. And so we will be more pressed for time on those days, and we'll have to get out of those, disengage from those labs in a timelier manner, just to make them available for the other courses. But Thursdays are good because we don't have anybody pushing us out, so to speak. Okay, so let's talk about the COVID situation, because things have changed and they have not changed. So at the state level, of course, the governor has rescinded the mask mandates. That has impacted the college somewhat. So in the general operational environment of the college, it does not appear that masking will be required. However, we did all receive an email from administration further clarifying that, stating that if you were faculty or you were student associated with a program that had a clinical component to it, i.e. taking care of patients, that unfortunately we are to remain masked during those lab exercises. So we will still have to wear masks, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, if you leave the lab environment and you're not in the lab environment, it is not clear to me that you have to wear a mask at that point. So like if you want to go to the bathroom and you leave the lab, you take your mask off. It really seems to only apply when we're working directly in the labs or potentially with potential patient contacts. So that's currently what the guidelines are. That's through the college. And we will see what happens as the situation evolves. So far, things seem to be improving as we transition further out of this Omicron wave. Okay. Any questions over that? Yes, sir. Okay. No. All right.
How do you think your storytelling will impact the future?
Chris, I got in a little late. What were you saying about the final exam?
What's that?
I was saying I got in a little late. What were you saying about the final exam?
Yeah, that I haven't put the grades in to Canvas yet because I need to do some analysis on the exams. So we'll analyze them and we will talk about that final exam at a later date, maybe tomorrow. If we're pretty busy tomorrow, though, it'll be during my office hours on Monday. So those of you that want to discuss it can log in during office hours. We'll see how things look tomorrow, though. So yeah, that's the situation there at the final exam. So there aren't official grades up yet. All right. Well, let's go ahead and go through the syllabus real quick for the course. Looks like everybody was able to access the link for the lectures. So lectures will be at the same days and same times. Just remember, we do have a spring break coming up. And I'll talk about that under the important dates section of the syllabus. So let me go ahead and pull the syllabus up here. It is also loaded into Canvas under the welcome module for everyone. So you can also reference it there as well. All right. Just opening it up. So I'm recovering from a computer crash that happened earlier this morning. So things are still coming back online. All right. So I think the best thing to do is just to go ahead and share this with you all. We'll go through it. And then we'll pivot right into lecture. And there will be no lab today. Today will just be lecture. All right. So let me pull up my iPad just so I am sure everybody can see that. All right, looks good. All right, here we are. So this is OEM 207, pharmacology, 3-credit class, same days and same times. The only exception is starting tomorrow, we will have afternoon labs, and we will essentially be having a lab every afternoon, every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoon. So we will be pretty busy. Pharmacology will be one of the more difficult courses. There's a lot of work, a lot of studying, lots of quizzes, drug card assignments, chapter summaries. This is a really busy course. But then the good thing is, once you get through this course, then we have ECG interpretation, and the operating tempo really settles down quite a bit, and it gives you a kind of some breathing room, and then it ramps back up as we move into the paramedic pipeline courses, cardiology, and so on. So this will probably be, for most people, this is probably going to be the most difficult course of the semester, and luckily we're kind of getting it done, sooner rather than later, getting it out of the way, and then things will settle down a little bit. All right, there I am. There is the best way of getting a hold of me and my office hours. All right, introduction and rationale. This is what the syllabus says about it. All right, and this is why we're taking it. These are the program learning objectives, and these are the learning outcomes that we look at upon you all completing this class, right? So how to show how to properly administer enteral and parenteral medicines, perform unit conversions, dosage calculations, for flow rate. You'll be able to discuss, identify indications, dose contraindications, adverse reaction, the pharmacokinetics and dynamics of different pharmaceuticals within our scope of practice. You'll be able to discuss, identify, list ethical, legal documentation aspects, pharmacology in medication administration, and you'll be able to use appropriate universal precautions. Required tech is the same that you've been using, Nancy Carolyn, Emergency Care in the Street, 8th edition. We will be working primarily out or exclusively out of volume 1. That's the larger of the 2 textbooks. And we will be working primarily from 3 chapters, emergency medications, medication administration, pharmacology, those 3 chapters. Same computer technology, same program, student learning outcomes, and the same methods of instruction. And this is all the same security information as well. Grading scale is the same, 80% or higher maintains a C average, and you need to maintain a C average or above to continue progressing through courses. All right, there you go. Testing, there will be a final exam. You will be allowed a retest on that exam if you don't do so well. However, the original score is what goes in the grade book. Let's see here. Makeup policy, there'll be case-by-case basis depending on your situation. There'll be lots of little quizzes. There'll be several little review and study videos, as well as various other assignments. Class attendance and participation is the same as the last class you were in. The general methods of evaluation are going to be more or less the same, with the exception of the lab component. You will have a hands-on component, or what we call a psychomotor component. You will have drug card assignments. These will be due essentially every day. You'll have a different set of drug cards. There are, I believe, 5 sets of drug cards, and I'll talk about those in more detail in just a little bit. There are also going to be interactive video assignments and quizzes associated with these videos that are going to do a deeper dive into specific drug classes and concepts relevant to pharmacology. Okay, these are the primary psychomotor requirements that you need to successfully complete. IV therapy, IV bolus medication, intravenous piggyback medications or infusions, interosseous infusions, intramuscular, subcutaneous, med-admin, intranasal, inhaled, topical, and enteral medication administration. All right. You will have to demonstrate competency in these areas as well. These are the general classroom management guidelines that are the same. All right, class participation and disciplinary issues are the same as well. And then these are some additional policies and procedures as they relate to the college and withdrawing and incompletes, disabilities or accessibility issues. All the relevant information has been placed in here. All right, online misconduct is the same as well. So this is our tentative schedule. All right, so you can see tentatively what we're going to be doing today is going to be, I'm going to be reviewing the course with you. We're going to be talking a little bit about history, legal milestones, pharmacokinetics, dynamics. We'll be talking about where you can find information. I'll show you the information for the state guidelines. And I'm also going to show you the links for our protocols, because we do have a medical director with this program. Most of you have met him already because he was heavily involved during the interview process. That's Dr. Benjamin Diven. He's also medical director for Las Cruces Fire Department, and so many of you probably know him in that role as well. We essentially have the same protocols as Las Cruces Fire Department, so we will be using the same link for that. There are a couple of minor exceptions. Of anything that is considered a special skill is not accessible to us or to you all as students. So for example, ketamine, right? Using ketamine is considered a special skill. You have to know about ketamine. You have to understand it as a medication, but you will not be able to administer that medication in the clinical environment. Even though you may be able to do it as a special skill through your department, we stick primarily to the state medication guidelines, and I will provide you all of those relevant links here in just a minute. All right, and that will continue on into the next week. And then you can see the 3rd is next Thursday, and then there's a big jump from the March 3rd to March 15th. And that is because the college will have its spring break the week of the 7 through 11 March. So there will be no class for that week. That is substantially earlier than most spring breaks. And I suspect that was done intentionally to try to keep people from traveling, I suppose, for COVID. To prevent COVID spread. That would be my guess as to why our spring break is so different or has been so different the last couple of years. But that's when we do our spring break, at least for now. And then we'll come back on March 15th and classes will continue more or less as normal. And let's see here, March 22nd will be the final day for pharmacology. I believe that's a Tuesday. And then we will pivot right in. We'll go from there right into ECG interpretation. And then from there, the last class you all will do this semester will be cardiovascular or cardiac emergencies. And then that you'll have a couple weeks off, and then that will go into the summer where we start respiratory in the medical block. These are the important dates, many of which we have already passed as far as the first day of classes, Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. Let's see here. So really the next significant date is going to be spring break that week of March 7 through 11. There will be a spring holiday on April 15th. I believe that's either a Monday or a Friday. And so that won't impact you directly because we don't have, I don't have class with you all on Mondays or Fridays, but I will, the college will be closed, so I'll generally be unavailable that day. And And again, it's either Monday or Friday. Final exam will be the week of May 6th, and May 6th will be the last day of classes. And then we'll have some time off, and then a couple weeks off, and then we'll transition into summer classes. All right. Any questions about the syllabus? All right, good. Make sure I'm up on chat. All right, excellent. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to take you through some of the modules on the course, show you how the course is set up. The course is set up more or less like all of your other classes. There are a couple of different exceptions, and I'll just review those real quickly. So let me go ahead and share that with you all. Okay. So you'll notice there is some additional material here in the introduction module, or the start here module. The welcome's the same. There is an etiquette assignment. Please make sure that you complete that. I believe it's due by the end of the day. Syllabus, this is a link for lectures. Of course, everybody found that. There's a link to the office hours for Mondays. And this is a link for the New Mexico EMS medication guidelines. So this is the state Department of Health, which the EMS Bureau falls under the Department of Health in New Mexico. And hopefully you all learned about the general setup of EMS in the state of New Mexico. Every state is a little different. At least in New Mexico, everything falls, EMS related falls under the Department of Health, the EMS Bureau, and then there are three major committees that fall under the EMS Bureau. There's a licensing committee, there's a medical direction committee, and then there's what we call the JOE committee, the Joint Organization on Education. Those are the three major committees that manage EMS here in the state. This is the link for the EMS program clinical protocols or guidelines. So let me just go ahead and open this. Oops. Get this bar out of the way here. There we go. So those of you that have not used it, you can actually copy this link right here, and you can put it on your tablet, your phone, your computer, star it. But you just click on Explore here, and then that brings you into the, let me get this bar out of the way there, the main directory. All right. So these are the made guidelines here. Just click on that, and then it'll bring you a list of guidelines. For example, you have got large groups of guidelines. So if it's cardiac related, environmental, medical emergencies, trauma, pediatrics, or obstetrics and gynecology, right? So you just click on, let's say we have a pediatric issue we want to reference our guidelines. So we'll pull that up. And let's say that this is a pediatric seizure. I'll click on that. And then this gives us our guidelines. And then we, of course, will be working under the paramedic level. So you can see all levels. All right. And then AEMT specific stuff, and then paramedic specific stuff. And of course, paramedic specific stuff includes AEMT and EMT level guidelines, right? Now, this says in endotracheal innovation, it says consider, but remember, we follow the state scope of practice, and in the state of New Mexico, we are not allowed to intubate to perform endotracheal innovation on pediatric patients. However, we will be doing it in class because it is still something at a national level you all have to understand, and you have to demonstrate some core competency in. So we will be covering it, and we will be practicing it in labs, but you will not be intubating children in the clinical environment. And hopefully you all talked about this in the intro class as far as the state of EMS in the United States is very very different in some ways to other professions or other occupations, and that EMS is very highly disjointed, and what you can do in one area varies substantially. And in fact, it can vary in some places from county to county, right? At least in New Mexico, we all more or less understand what's going on at a state level because everything is very well organized at state level. That's not necessarily the case in other states. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Hey, Chris, I was wondering what you thought of, I was reading an article yesterday from EMS One, and they're talking about going away with the NREMT skills testing. I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, that's it's contentious, and it always has been. And so there are actually states that do not use National Registry. New Mexico currently does, and we'll see what happens in the future. As far as my opinion goes, that's maybe a little more complicated. And I might elaborate on that a little later on. I hate I don't want to speak ill of agencies and organizations that have done a lot for EMS federally, but I will say this: people that are concerned about the skills testing for National Registry and other things that are going on, I would say their concerns have merit for sure. And that's just another example of how fractured in a sense EMS really is that, we don't, even at a national level, we're not really all on the same page. Whereas other professions, and I use nursing because I am a nurse as well, as an example, whereas nursing, right, everybody in the nation, everybody in the country recognizes the same licensing examination, right? So it doesn't matter where you live in the United States, what state you're in, everybody takes the same licensing exam. And so I could be in California, and if I graduate nursing, an accredited nursing program through one of the nationally recognized, accrediting organizations, NLNAC, et cetera, and I successfully complete that exam, it's called the NCLEX, the NCLEX RN for registered nurses, then you are recognized, you can license in any state in the United States. And that's what I did. I did not go to nursing school here in New Mexico. I went a completely different state. Wyoming is where I graduated from nursing school. And I just filed for reciprocity and was given a license in the state of New Mexico. As some of you all know, that is not the case with EMS, right? It is not very consistent like that. And so there's a substantial amount of work ahead of us. We face an uphill battle, and it has been really difficult. And there are a lot of historical reasons for that. You guys studied the history of EMS in the intro class. Did you go into the history and how it came about in the United States?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So just historically, right? I mean, we didn't have our own, we fell under the Department of Transportation, right? Which is like, well, why would a healthcare professional fall under the DOT? And you realize, oh, well, because the initial regulation came out of, the white paper, which was, trauma, the neglected disease of society. And then that galvanized people to make legislation about how do we decrease morbidity and mortality related to traffic accidents, and organizing EMS systems kind of came out of that. And so we fell under the DOT, but we're more medical, and so it's just kind of all over the place, and we've had a real uphill battle. People tend not to be on the same page as much as other professions as well, particularly at a national level. And as you all understand, the way that things get done at a federal level, it, involves a lot of money, a lot of lobbyists that are on the same page, working together, pushing for changes that everybody pretty much agrees on, or large numbers of people with money and power and that can agree on, we'll say. And it's just so fractured and just jointed in EMS. It's really tough. So yeah, so to answer the question, it's really contentious. And I am ambivalent. My opinion, my personal opinion is one of ambivalency. I do have my issues, my issues regarding National Registry. Do I think that any state does it better? I don't know. It's hard to say. Yeah, so it'll be interesting moving forward. I will say that many medical professions don't have this psychomotor testing requirement. You don't see that with nursing school, right? If you graduate nursing school, the assumption is, look, you graduated an accredited nursing program, you got the clinical and the psychomotor experience that you needed, and so you take a test. You pass a computer adaptive test, right? They don't have this additional, you have to go to this skill site and you have to demonstrate skills and that in front of people. We don't see this in respiratory therapy. I'm also a respiratory therapist. We don't see this kind of thing there as well. Even in medical school, right? Physicians have to demonstrate psychomotor competency, but they do it in their education, and then they take a written test, so to speak. Actually, they take several tests. They take something called the USMLE, or the United States Medical Licensure Exam, and there are different steps to it: step 1, 2, 3, etc. But still, what we do for testing with paramedics, at least states that use National Registry, is very unique, very different from other healthcare providers, shall we say. Yeah. All right. So that is how you can reference your clinical practice guidelines in this program. So I would strongly recommend that you bookmark all of these links, particularly because this class will go away, right? Once it closes. So you want to have those links and you want to be able to reference those. Really good references, particularly once we start working through scenarios in the lab environment later on in the course, where you're going to be using flip books, field guides, things like that to try to help facilitate a better clinical decision making. Okay, so that's what we've got there. Let me go back. This link right here, let me wait for things to catch up. This link right here is just some additional information. It's an online drug reference. There are many, and we'll talk about them actually in this first lecture. This is the link to your textbook online, should you be more comfortable using an online format with a textbook. I think probably for me, it's just, I'm just old. I really, unfortunately, I don't know how it happened, but it's just like one day I realized I am completely culturally irrelevant, and probably have been for quite some time. And so online textbooks really don't resonate with me that well. I prefer to have a physical textbook that I can write in and mark in, take notes on. But I understand that people prefer online format, so I want you all to have access to that as well. Okay, so this is your homework. Well, one of your homework assignments. This is the pharmacology chapters review. So the 3 chapters I told you about earlier, all 3 of those have been condensed into one assignment. It's a large assignment. It's worth 25, 26 points, excuse me. It'll be due at the end of the course. So you can download the file there and you can turn it in there. Your Zoom lectures will go in here. I did just put up a PowerPoint presentation. This is a little PowerPoint that I'll be running from today, and I just included that. But as the lectures get loaded and uploaded to the cloud, I will put them in here like your other classes. Okay, let's talk about this dreaded assignment. Many of you may have already heard about these. These are the drug card assignments. I find that people maybe make this a little harder than it needs to be. You might make more work for yourself than need be. So I will talk about drug card assignments. So you're going to have, I believe, 5 different sets of drug cards, and you may have, 20 some drug cards due per day, and that can seem overwhelming, and it can't, and sometimes it is. This is something I had to do in nursing school. In fact, in nursing school, we would be doing clinicals at the same time we were in class. Whereas with paramedic school, we do what's called front loading. We front load all the didactic and lab. And so you spend half the time in didactic and lab and then finish that, and then you do the rest in clinical. In nursing school, we were doing both at the same time. And so what would happen was we would have to do what's called preclinicals. So on Monday afternoon, when we got out of lecture or lab Monday afternoon, we would have to go up to the hospital and we would have our patient assignments Monday night. And we would have to spend a couple hours, sometimes several hours at the hospital. We'd have to review the patient's chart, their information, and we have to do a full preclinical workup, and we'd have to do a drug card on every single drug every single one of our patients was on. And then Tuesday morning, it was about 5 in the morning, we would muster essentially, and we would line up, and our instructor would come by and they would inspect our uniform. We had very strict uniform requirements. They look at our drug cards, they look at our preclinical paperwork, our care plan that we had drawn up the night before, and they'd either give us the yay or nay. And if they gave us the nay, we would get kicked out and sent home. And if that happened, I think twice, that would be removal from the program. I definitely have been there. I've definitely felt the stress of having to do these, because I was just doing these for 2.5 years. You guys will be able to, you all will be able to get through it. So what does this entail? Well, this entails each set of drug cards will kind of cover a certain theme. So your first set of drug cards will be due on next Tuesday, March 1st. And the theme there is going to be a lot of the autonomic pharmacology, which is a huge part of what we do as paramedics, right? One of the most important, from a pharmacological standpoint, one of the most important areas of the aspects of the body is the autonomic nervous system. And many of the drugs that we use, commonly use, impact the autonomic nervous system. So that would make sense that would be one of the first things that we would study. And so this is an example of a drug card. Let me go ahead and open this up. Download this. And I'm just going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pull this drug card up out of my downloads. And I'll show you what a drug card looks like. So essentially it's a 3 by 5, 3.5 by 5 inch index card, just a standard index card. And this is what you're going to want to write. So for each drug on the drug card assignment, this is what it'll look like. So on the front of the drug card, you're going to have the name of the drug. So essentially what you're doing is something called a drug profile. And we'll talk about, what a profile is, but this is what a drug profile is, right? So what is the generic name of the drug? Albuterol in this case. What is the trade name? And there may be a couple of different trade names. So Proventil or Ventolin. What class of a drug is this? It's a beta-2 agonist. It's an inhaled bronchodilator. And what's the mechanism of action? Stimulates beta-2 receptors. So you see, I'm not writing a textbook on every drug. This is just down and dirty need to know information on these drugs. What are the major contraindications, right? Not every single caution that you can think of, but when you're researching this drug, like what are the most important things that we need to know? What are the most important contraindications? What are the most important or common adverse effects, right? Tachycardia, anxiety, tremors, hypertension, hypokalemia, right? I mean, these are the heavy hitting adverse effects that we are most concerned about when it comes to something like albuterol. What is the major adult dose, pediatric dose, right? And you can see that there are different ways of giving albuterol. You can use a meter dose inhaler versus a small volume nebulizer. And then there are other ways using large volume, but that is more of a special consideration, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then on the back of the card is where any special information goes. So special considerations, right? And so there we go. Continuous or large volume nebulized therapy may be used as a part of comprehensive treatment for life-threatening hyperkalemia, for example. What is a pregnancy category of this medication? And then what are the basic pharmacokinetics of this? So the plasma half-life, how is it metabolized? So this is primarily metabolized in the gastrointestinal tract by the SULTIA3, so it's a sulfurotransferase enzyme. And then 80 to 100% of it is eliminated via the kidneys. And that is what we're looking at for drug cards. So I'm going to stop sharing there. And let me just pull up a drug card assignment. So we'll just pull up this first assignment that'll be due on Tuesday. Go back into share here. There we go. All right. So here is drug card set 1. All right. I don't know why this keeps popping up, why this keeps saying July 17th. So the due date is the due date on the link in the module. So you can see is primarily autonomic medications. And I've kind of color coded these. So each set of drug cards has its own color. So these are the autonomic medications. These are crystalloids and colloids. We'll be talking about a little bit about different IV solutions, hypertonic saline, and blood products. And what you can do with blood products is you can, because the cautions and contraindications in that are very similar between all of these, you can just have one drug card with all of the blood products on because the cautions and contraindications are very similar with those. But for these, for example, these are all different medications with different doses and so on. And so I will expect a unique drug card for each of those. There we go. And then just some what are called colloids, right? So you've got so you got crystalloids and so you got your isotonic crystalloids, your hypertonic, you got your blood colloids, and then your non-blood colloids. And that's it for that assignment. And so what I would suggest you do to make it easy on yourself, do the drug card and then take the drug cards and put them out on a table on the front facing up, right? And just start at epinephrine and just put them out on a square on a table, and then just take your camera, take a camera that can produce a decent picture that I can see, take a picture of the front of the cards, flip them over on their backs, take a picture of the backs, and then just attach those two pictures as JPEGs to the assignment. And then I can go in, I can take a look. And as long as the picture is of sufficient quality, and I can see that you did the work, you get the credit. And that will, that if you want to do it as a PDF file, if you want to, you use your camera as a scanner, you have a scanning app, that's fine as well. So that's the drug card assignments. So, oops. Let's go back there. And you will see on the right-hand column of Canvas, upcoming assignments as well. But the due dates for those assignments are right here on the module. So 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, 3.15, and 3.16. So you have a total of 5 sets of drug cards due. You will have some pop quizzes that'll come up. There will be a quiz that's due tomorrow over information that we're going to be covering today. And in addition to that, you will have some homework assignments. So you got this dosage calculation set 1. I would not attempt to work on this until after tomorrow, because tomorrow is when I'm going to lecture on medical math dosage calculations. However, you will have your first module, your first class of medications module due tomorrow. And so what I've done is I've uploaded short videos. These are like 5 to 7 minute videos, so they're not very long, that cover very specific aspects of pharmacology. So these first set of videos are going to focus primarily on the autonomic nervous system. And this is just so incredibly important. So there's an overview of autonomic anatomy and physiology, and then there's a little quiz that accompanies the video. And then we'll be talking about cholinergic agents that activate the cholinergic or parasympathetic nervous system. And then there'll be a little quiz there. Anticholinergic agents that block or antagonize the parasympathetic nervous system. And then there'll be a little quiz there. Adrenergic agents, these are adrenaline-like agents. Yes, sir.
Are these, sorry, I don't know if I was one, but are these all due the 23rd today?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So that's why we're not doing a lab, because you guys will have some work to do this afternoon. So it would not be fair to make you come into lab and then, oh yeah, by the way, sometime before midnight, you have all this other stuff you need to do. So yeah, no lab for this reason. And then the next will be anti-adrenergics or sympatholytics. These are agents that block the sympathetic nervous system. So you've got agents that mimic the sympathetic, the adrenergics or adrenaline-like, or the sympathomimetics, and then agents that block. And then we will talk about push dose epinephrine specifically, because this is a newer way of using vasoactive agents that in some situations may be helpful, because we don't have to get a drip up and calculate a flow rate and titrate it. We can just rapidly mix push dose epinephrine, get that on board in an attempt to stabilize that patient. And then the next group of videos are will include cardiovascular pharmacology, another important one, and you'll see the due dates on those, and so on and so forth. Barbiturates, benzodiazepines, opioids, and induction agents, and so on. And then additional videos will open up as well, but these are the first few assignments. Just as a review, you will have several things that you'll be working on. You'll have your drug card assignments, you'll have the video and quizzes, you'll have the chapter summaries that you'll be working on, and then there will be some additional assignments such as dosage calculations that will come into play. And then of course we will be doing labs as well. So you can see this is going to be a really busy fire hose kind of class, a lot of stuff going on. So just really hang in there, just dig your heels in. And you will get through it, and then things will really ease up a bit for ECG interpretation. So just pharmacology is just one of those classes that, there's a lot of work that goes into it. It's such an important foundational course. And the delta or the difference between, say, the EMT or even the advanced EMT and the paramedic, the foundation of knowledge is so different, so much larger, so much more encompassing as a paramedic that, it just warrants an entire standalone pharmacology class. All right. How's everyone doing? Any questions over any of that stuff? All right. I'm going to stop sharing. Looks like we're coming up on our first hour. And so I think we're in a good spot. So what we're going to do is after the break, I'm going to roll right into the lecture. And the rest of the day will be spent on that lecture. And then I'll let you all out. And then you'll have the rest of the afternoon to get through the videos. And what I did is I did not make a drug card assignment due for tomorrow, even though we will be talking about the adrenergic the autonomic nervous system tomorrow a little bit. I did not make the drug cards due tomorrow because you have all these little videos and quizzes due. Again, I'm not trying to destroy anybody, so to speak. I do want to try to spread that out a little bit so you all are able to get through this without too much stress. Well, if there are no questions, I think we'll go ahead and just take our first break. I've got 9:20, let's just say it's 9:25. I will see you all back at 9. Let's do 9:40. Let's come back at 9:40 and we'll roll right into lecture.
Hey, Chris, real quick.
Yes.
So our book only covers 2 chapters in pharmacology, the principles of pharmacology and medication administration. Which one was the third one?
Emergency medications, I believe is what it's called.
Okay, I'll have to look for it in the book then.
Yeah, it's I believe it's an appendix. It's appendix. I don't know what appendix, but it basically has a bunch of drug profiles in it. So
Okay.
like it'd be a great resource for drug cards because basically it's a big list of drug cards in the back of the book.
Yeah, it starts in the, for those listening, 1495.
Okay, yeah, and it's basically just a big list of drug cards. And so a lot of the drug card information you could actually reference from that appendix. So that's why I included it, because it's an important reference for you all.
Awesome.
All right, so let's go in and talk about pharmacology proper now. So before we get into the lecture, or the presentation that I have loaded into Canvas for you all, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the regulations, some of the regulatory aspects of pharmacology, and then we'll get into the PowerPoint here in just a little bit. So I'm not going to talk about every single act and law that has been enacted, but I do want to talk about some of the major ones here. So let me go ahead and do share with you all. Okay, looks like y'all can see that all right. Okay, good. All right. So prior to about 1900, it was kind of the Wild West, so to speak, in the United States, and we're going to focus on the United States. I'll say that in the 1800s, there were a couple of notable things that did happen. One of them was something called the USP was developed, and this was actually in 1820. And the USP stands for the United States Pharmacopoeia. All right, the United States Pharmacopoeia, or the USP. And essentially what this was is this is a collection of information from physicians and pharmacists, colleges, pharmacy colleges, etc., to try to create a central repository of pharmaceutical knowledge that anyone can reference. And this was started in 1820 and has been further developed, as we'll talk about, in more contemporary times. And then by the late 1800s, there was something called a national formulary, which are kind of like at a national level, what are the kinds of drugs that are that were generally approved, that we would generally approve of, that you know, are of good quality and purity, and so on and so forth. And that really started in the late 1800s. So by about I think it was 1896 or thereabouts, is when the concept of a formulary really came about. Right? Kind of, this is kind of the, if you want to think about it as a kind of the a resource saying these are kind of the drugs that medications, and I'm going to use drug and medication synonymously because they are the same thing in for pharmaceutical purposes. The concept of a formulary became relevant. But it really wasn't until the 1900s when we saw the some of the major regulations that did and continue to really inform the regulatory nature of pharmacology, even as it applies to us as paramedics. All right. So the first major one that I want to talk about was something that was passed in 1906. And in 1906, something referred to as the Pure Food and Drugs Act was enacted. The Pure Food and Drugs Act. This is the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906. And essentially what happened was in 1906, there was actually a book that was published called The Jungle. I believe it was Upton Sinclair who published this, and it talked about the horrid conditions in certain industries, such as meatpacking, I believe. And they were talking about people like an instance where a guy slipped and fell into a canister full of fat or lard, and just some horrible stuff. And at the same time, there were lots of nonfiction books that were being that kind of came out. Let's see. There was a guy by the name of Harvey Wiley, I believe, and was part of the chemistry bureau. And he was recruiting people into what was vernacularly known as the quote unquote poison squad. And essentially what was going on there was they would ingest different substances like formaldehyde and boric acid and so on and so forth. And as you might imagine, they started having lots of side effects to this experimentation, if you will. And so it was really a kind of a combination of things going on, you know, this avant-garde, you know, practicing on ourselves in horrible conditions, and really that galvanized people, that galvanized legislators to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act, right? And this at a federal level really did several things, right? It included things against what's called misbranding, right? And so you had to brand, like when you put a drug on the market, you had to brand it correctly, right? And you know, if it contained, you know, stuff like, you know, opium or cocaine or potentially addictive stuff, because we did understand addiction somewhat at that point in time. And if it wasn't labeled appropriately, it didn't say, hey, there are these addictive things, and this is how much is in there, then that would violate the law. And so this was not only labeling, right, but advertising as well, right? So the Pure Food and Drug Act was relevant there as well. All right, what's being labeled, what's actually being advertised, and so on and so forth. So that was one of the first major acts of the 18th century, or excuse me, the 20th century, pertaining to the United States. And then in 1914, a few years later, another pivotal another pivotal act was legislated, and this is known as the Harrison Narcotics Act. The Harrison Narcotics Act. And most people refer to this as the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. And essentially what this did is it placed a tax on the production and sale and use of primarily opium was the primary narcotic at that time. And they set limits like on the allowable limits of narcotics, right? And it also mandated that there had to be some sort of record keeping. You couldn't just willy-nilly hand out opium to anybody who wanted it at any concentration. We actually need to have record keeping, and this primarily pertained to physicians and pharmacists and individuals who dispense so-called narcotics, right? So that was a big part of that now, right? So you've got labeling and manufacturing and advertising legislation in 1906. And then you've got, well, you need to actually say what's in here and what's the dose and what limit are you allowed. And you actually have to document, right? Who you're giving this to, how much are you giving them, so on and so forth. That was 1914. And then in the 1930s, another pivotal act was passed, and this was in 1938 specifically, and this is referred to as the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic. So this is a Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, and this is actually fairly newly passed under FDR, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and this is fairly new. He just come on board as a new president at the time, and he actually began. A big part of what he did was pushing for more regulation of industry, and this is one of those regulatory acts. And it essentially, what happened at this time was it was an antibiotic, or a proto-antibiotic, if you will. Proper, like penicillin hadn't quite made it around by the 1930s, although it was right there. This is actually about the same time that Fleming discovered penicillin inadvertently, but this is a sulfa-based antibiotic that had been developed, and it actually had it ended up killing a lot of people. It contained something called diethylene glycol, which is very similar to ethylene glycol, and it was very toxic to kidneys, right? And over 100 people ended up dying, mostly kids. So in response to that, what happened was essentially that and some other things galvanized the administration to pass this act to further regulate what goes into the manufacturing and development of a drug. All right. And again, I'm kind of going high yield here, big picture, because there's a lot of different stuff that goes into these different acts. So I'm just kind of focusing on the high yield stuff. All right. And then in 1950s, specifically 1951.
Chris, real quick, you said the Pure Food and Drug Act was the labeling, Harrison Narcotic Act was the dose kind of regulation. What would you say the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act did again?
Okay, so the Pure Food and Drug Act, that's way back in 1906, right? So we'll just kind of start kind of from the beginning, if you will, right? So yes, a big part of the Pure Food and Drug Act was labeling and advertising, or excuse me, labeling only. So this was really only labeling. Yeah. and not advertising, at least not yet. All right. So this is how you have to label things. And then in 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act placed a tax on the production, sale, use primarily of opium, right? So it involved taxation, primarily focused on opium, and it set limits to how much you could essentially have and give. And it also set a standard for documentation, right? Documenting who you're giving it to, who's getting it, how much are they getting, right? So labeling, and then limits and documentation. And then in 1938, right, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is all about misbranding and trying to eliminate contamination, or what we call adulteration. When we say something has been adulterated, that essentially means that it has been contaminated with something. All right. Now, there are many other provisions as far as like manufacturing requirements and so on and so forth that go into this. And then in 1951, there was something called the Durham-Humphrey Amendment. I'll mention that. Also known as the Durham-Humphrey Amendment of 1951. All right. And essentially what this did is this helped distinguish or help develop a way of understanding what the difference, in a legal sense, what the difference is between over-the-counter drugs. All right. So what constitutes an over-the-counter drug and what constitutes a prescription? And what systems of controls go into place there to help with that differentiation. That's where that all started in 1951. All right. And then the next major one I want to talk about occurred a fair bit later. All right. And this is a very important one because it really it changed the entire zeitgeist of the world as far as specifically how we look at substances that may be addictive in nature. All right. Does anyone happen to know what that was? I'll give you a hint. It was in the 1970s under Nixon.
The Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act.
What's that?
The Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, where they classed them. They started classing the drugs, class 1, class.
Yep, that's it. Yeah. So in 1970, to be specific, under Nixon, something called the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. So the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Control Act. All right. Of 1970. And this is one of the most important policies that still impacts us today. And this, of course, set up something called the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, which is a law enforcement agency. So this is an agency that can actually has the power to investigate, the power to arrest, and present evidence to prosecutors, right? Whereas the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, does not have law enforcement capabilities, right? So there is a big differentiation between the DEA and the FDA. And the big thing that came from this is the scheduling of substances. And we will go into scheduling in a little bit of detail a little later on, right? So you've got schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are the major schedules. And we are still working under the Controlled Substances Act. This is also known as, I should say, this is also known as the Controlled Substances Act. But the full name is the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Control Act, also known as the Controlled Substances Act 1970. We are still working under this today, and this actually started, it kicked off something that we vernacularly refer to as the quote unquote war on drugs. The war on drugs. And we are still engaged in that today. And in fact, the situation is very complicated today because there is a tension. There is an unresolved tension that is going on that is impacting many places in the country. And does anyone happen to know what this tension is now?
The legalization of marijuana.
Yeah, it primarily revolves around marijuana. And so what we have is we have marijuana. And we have marijuana that has been legalized for both medicinal and or recreational use in many states. Here's the thing though. What does that mean as far as the Controlled Substances Act? What do you all think? What does that mean?
Under that Controlled Substances Act, it had no medicinal use. It was Schedule 1, I believe.
Yeah, so marijuana is considered, and cannabis in general is considered a Schedule 1, and a Schedule 1 is something that has high abuse potential and no recognized medical use. And marijuana does fall under Schedule 1. But here's the thing, these are federal, right? These are all federal legislative measures. These are bills that became laws, right? Marijuana legalization is occurring at a state level. And so what this has done is this has set some tension up between federal and state powers. And this is always throughout the history of the United States, this has been a constant source of tension as where do the powers of the federal government begin and end, and where do the powers of the state, the individual states, because sometimes state means the federal government, but I'm talking about the state or the provincial governments, because each state kind of has its own governmental structure. Where do those end and begin? Where's the overlap? And we can see lots of tension occurring. And at some point, this tension will have to be resolved one way or the other, right? There'll have to be some resolution because it's becoming messier and messier every day. As you know, people in healthcare, for example, have run into, right? Like it may be legal, quote unquote, to do something in a state, but it is still illegal at the federal level. And interestingly enough, there are certain states that have laws, state laws that say certain things are illegal, quote unquote, at a state level that may be not considered illegal at a federal level. So there's always that tension between the individual state and then the capital state or the federal government. And this is one of those areas where we're going to have some resolution. All right, so that's the major, those are the major legislative issues, laws, acts that I wanted to discuss, and they occasionally show up as test questions. So I just want to make sure that we covered them. and the implications of them reverberate into contemporary society today as far as what we have to deal with at an administrative level when we are looking at administering, utilizing pharmaceutical agents. Okay, excellent. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop that, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull up the next presentation. And we'll go through it. Hopefully, I hope to get through the whole thing today. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. So I'm just going to go ahead and share this with you all. There we go. Let me see if everyone can see that. All right. This is a started screen sharing, but it is definitely taking its time. There we go. All right, so this is Introduction to Pharmacology, right? So I just put up a few pictures that kind of represent the use of pharmacology in the pre-hospital environment. Here's a picture of someone giving an intravenous bolus of medication. Here's a pic. This is actually a picture of me, a much younger me, back when I was flying full time. Does anyone know who this old crusty man is here? He actually is still out there working. He was my FTO when I was a new flight nurse. Anyone recognize that that mustache, that powerful mustache there?
Is that B-Rad?
That's Brad Davison. Yep. Yeah, Brad was my my FTO when I was a new flight medic, or flight nurse rather. He was a flight medic. He was also working as a cath lab tech at the time as well. It's interesting to see a paramedic working full time in the cath lab. So kind of a cool experience there. This over here is a picture. This is actually me, and this is a really cool guy. His name by the name of Ashton. He was is actually a South African physician. He's in the South African military now as a surgeon, I believe. But this is when I was doing remote medicine. I was doing contract work in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this specific situation is a gentleman who had a hypertensive crisis, caused a rupture of an aneurysm, a Barry aneurysm, the base of his brain. He had a severe subarachnoid hemorrhage. You can't see it in this picture. I actually took it out, but he actually had a drain. I believe an intraventricular drain had been placed, and we were draining blood out of his ventricles of his brain to try to keep his intracranial pressure down. But he ended up developing another hypertensive crisis during the flight, and this is actually a Russian plane. This is an Antonov, is an AN-26. It was used to deliver fruit. So we were able to contract these Russians, this Russian crew to fly this Antonov and to fly us into Iraq, into Balad airfield, to try to stabilize this gentleman here and take him all the way to Dubai, to the neurospinal hospital in Dubai. And that's like a 6.5-hour flight one way. So this is a very long day. Anyway, this is a very, very sick patient, very unstable. He had a hypertensive emergency during the flight. And so you can see that I'm setting up a beta blocker infusion here on one of our syringe pumps. So and this is a kind of an interesting configuration where in a lot of places outside of the United States, paramedics and physicians work together in teams outside of the hospital, flying and doing critical care, whereas you don't see as much of that here in the United States. So it's just kind of a cool little picture to demonstrate how diverse pharmacology is throughout the world, involving EMS providers. All right. So unfortunately, there is a little bit of this in pharmacology, although we will try to keep it to a minimum. We're not going to go deep take deep dives into the chemical structure. For example, this is a picture of talking about benzodiazepines and the chemical structure of benzodiazepines and different functional groups on the carbons of the benzene rings, and how that impacts the duration of action of these different molecules. This is some stuff that I studied in graduate school because I have a degree, graduate level degree in pharmaceutical sciences. This looks like a bunch of coordination chemistry using either crystal field theory or ligand field theory to basically talk about electron structure in metals and transition metals, and their different systems, high and low spin systems that get created. So metal chemistry is really important in pharmacology, toxicology. And then this looks like I'm just doing some reading and taking some notes on salicylate toxicity. This looks like Goldfrank's Toxicological Emergencies, this book here. Yeah, so we'll try to keep that to a minimum. So as we go through this lecture, just remember anything in red, it emphasizes critical concepts. So if you see something in red, that's a key or it's an important concept that you want to focus in on. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about this. Pharmacology, what is it? Well, it's a study of drugs, their sources, their nature and properties, right? Specifically, it's the study of the interactions that occur between living organisms, i.e. us, and the chemicals that affect normal or abnormal biochemical function, right? And it encompasses lots of things, right? Drug composition, their properties, the different interactions, toxicology, using drugs. And I use the term drug and medication synonymously. It means the same thing. Some people, for whatever reason, probably for historical reasons or media, popular media, drug tends to have a negative connotation associated with it. Like drug is something different, drug is something bad. Drug is the same thing as a medication. So I'll use those more or less interchangeably in this class. And then the different medical applications and anti-pathogenic capabilities of certain classes of agents. All right, so two big basic terms to get out of the way first. These are pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics. So pharmacodynamics is the study of the interaction of chemicals with biological receptors about 90% of the time. So to simplify that, pharmacodynamics is what a drug does to the body. Okay, that's pharmacodynamics, what a drug does to the body. Pharmacokinetics, however, is the study of the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion of chemicals from biological systems. Put more simply, or stated plainly, pharmacokinetics is what the body does to the drug, right? So how a drug gets into the body, how does a body change the drug, and how does a drug get eliminated from it? That is all pharmacokinetics. It's think of it as the movement of the drug, right? How does the drug change? So pharmacokinetics is what the body does to a drug. Pharmacodynamics is what a drug does to the body. All right. So let's just talk a little bit about drug development here. So drugs are derived from a variety of sources, many different plants, right? The belladonna plant, for example, right? Belladonna means pretty woman. It is where atropine and atropine-like molecules come from, right? Or various anticholinergics come from. Animals, right? For example, insulin. Insulin used to come from grinding up the pancreases of animals, of pigs and whatnot, and obtaining insulin. We do it a little differently now, but that's how insulin came from. So many of our antivenoms, right? We talked about that in pathophysiology, right? Many of the antibodies that we use to treat different poisonings and envenomations come from animals, right? They're made by animals by exposing animals to different antigens. Various minerals, right? Sodium chloride, various chemicals that are produced in labs, and something called recombinant DNA technology, where we can actually put genes or genetic information into cells and have those cells create drugs for us. Typically, this is bacteria. We actually have bacteria, and then we insert genes or we insert genetic material into the bacteria, and then that bacteria becomes a drug producing factory. And many medications are produced in that way using so-called recombinant DNA technology. The major regulator of drug development, drug testing, and drug approval is the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, right? They regulate the testing and approval or release of agents onto the market. Now, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, they enforce the criminal aspect of drugs, right? But the FDA regulates, okay, what are the policies, procedures, and protocols for developing new drugs, testing them, getting them out on the market, and then, surveying them after they've been approved, right? That's all under the umbrella of the FDA. So drug development is incredibly complicated. It generally takes multiple years to get a drug to the market, and a lot of that is just there's a lot of trial and error goes into this, right? An incredible amount of basic research, and then from that basic research, right, you can have thousands and thousands of different agents, right? Typically 5,000 to 20,000 different agents, and then what we do is we test those agents on animals. And this is called preclinical research, where we use computer modeling and animal testing to figure out if there's any way that this might have any benefit for humans. And then of those hundreds that make it through preclinical, maybe less than half a dozen actually show that they might have some effectiveness. And then you do clinical research on people, and you might get one drug, right? And so you can see that, getting a single drug to the market tends to take multiple years. Even, interestingly enough, even when we talk about like the current vaccines, the messenger RNA vaccines for SARS-CoV-2, a lot of people say, well, that happened, too quickly. It did happen fairly quickly because, we were able to pump a lot of money into it, but people don't understand that the basic research and the drug discovery and some of the preclinical research, right? So these first three things that pertaining to messenger RNA vaccines, that actually started back in the 1990s, like the early 1990s is when a lot of the basic research and some of the basic drug discovery, where we were figuring out how can I put messenger RNA into a lipid nanoparticle, right? That kind of stuff was actually being done in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, right? So decades ago, right? That actually started for the current messenger RNA vaccines that we see now. So in fact, that has been going on for quite some time. And in fact, there was even preclinical and a little bit of clinical research going on in the 90s and 2000s regarding messenger RNA technology. So that's just one example. But, it can take, if things go well, it can take a decade or more to get a new drug to the market. All right. So we're just going to take a bigger look into this. So the initial research and development, you're looking at somewhere around 3 to 6 years, right? And this is the basic scientific molecular biology, essentially, where people are like, okay, we have this agent and it seems to attach to a certain receptor. Okay, well, maybe that's a target for a new therapeutic, right? And like I said, you may have tens of thousands of different compounds, and then you have to select, okay, what out of these tens of thousands, based on computer modeling, and maybe we'll isolate receptors from cells and we'll do some tests, right? Figure out, okay, what are the top candidates, right? So basically you've got 10,000 plus resumes that you're looking at, and you're filtering them out, and you're like, okay, so now we may have, of these tens of thousands, we're going to filter out some thousand of those, right? And then we will do what are called in vitro studies, right? Additional in vitro. And this is in vitro essentially means in the lab, right? In a test tube, quote unquote. And then maybe some in vivo, which is in an organism, typically animals, right? And typically what they require is that you test this in at least 2 mammalian species, right? 2 mammals. Again, just to give us some idea of what to go with. And then, that generally takes a year or so. And then you'll go in and do clinical trials on human patients. And there are 3 major phases of clinical trials: phase 1, 2, and 3. And sometimes phase 1 and phase 2 can occur at the same time. That's actually what happened with the messenger RNA technology. Typically, clinical trials take anywhere from 4 to 7 years. And a lot of that time is just the amount of money. There's an incredible amount of money required to run clinical trials. And so you find if you have lots of money, you can get through this much faster. So this is just kind of looking at averages here. All right. So phase 1 clinical trials, essentially what you're doing is, now that you've done all the research and development preclinical studies, you want to figure out, okay, what is the safety profile of this drug, of this new agent, right? And so you will test it on 20 to maybe 100 healthy volunteers. So you take healthy volunteers and you give it to them, and you figure out what are the safety issues, and what doses tend to be tolerated by healthy people. And then if it gets through that, then you do phase 2 trials. Typically you're looking at a couple of hundred people or so, 1 to 300 people. And what you're trying to do here is you're actually trying to determine. So in phase 1, think of it as safety. Phase 1 is all about safety. And then phase 2 is all about dose. We got to figure out, okay, what dose, and is this going to work in people that have the problem, right? That have the disease, or maybe, it's a blood pressure drug or a diabetic drug or whatever, right? And then after you get through phase 2 clinical trials, then you move to phase 3 clinical trials, where you test it on large numbers of people, typically in the thousands, looking at it in a larger sample of the population, for both safety and effectiveness. And with a phase 3 clinical trial, it needs to occur in multiple places. Typically we use hospitals, and it needs to be separate hospitals, right? In separate areas of the country, so that you're sure that you have a good sample of the population at large, right? And if it makes through phase 3, then it can get officially approved by the FDA. Now, in some instances, if a drug makes it through phase 3 and it's effective and it's safe and all that, but it hasn't been approved, if there is a critical need for that particular agent, there is something called an EUA, or an emergency use authorization, where that particular drug or that agent might go onto the market under an EUA prior to receiving the official approval, if you will, from the FDA. And we saw that with the COVID vaccines, the 2 messenger RNA and the adenovirus vector, the Johnson & Johnson, right? They were using them under an EUA, and now there has been official that now they are officially FDA approved. So you can see this is a fairly complex process, and I just want you all to be aware of kind of the big picture of, what does it actually take to get something to the market. It's super complicated. It takes a lot of money. All right. So these are the phases of trials. So remember, phase 1 is all about safety. Phase 2 is all about effectiveness. Phase 3 is safety and effectiveness in a large sample of the population at multiple centers. And the gold standard for this is something called an RCT, a randomized clinical trial. So you randomly select people from the population, so you have a good sample, right? And you have what are called placebos and blinding. So what you do is you give some people a placebo, right? A sugar pill or a shot of saline, that's something that's completely inactive. And then you give some group the intervention, the drug or whatever, the vaccine, right? And then you compare the placebo to the what we call the control group, the people that get the placebo, they're known as the control. So that's where the control part of the RCT comes from. And then the other part of it is blinding. And the standard is double blinding. So the subjects in the trial, they don't know who's getting the placebo or the medication. And the researchers don't know either. They're just collecting data. And then toward the end of the trial, they will unblind them, and then they will look at the data, right? And that's done to remove as much bias as possible, right? And and another reason is there is something called the placebo effect, which is very powerful. If somebody thinks that they are getting a drug that is going to work, right, there is often a physiological response. And so what you have to do is you have to show that these agents are at least a little better than placebo. And then after a drug is approved for the market, the studying does not stop there. You will move into what's called phase 4 clinical trials. This is also referred to as post-marketing surveillance or post-marketing studies, where we continue to follow that, because sometimes years or decades after a drug goes to the market, there are unanticipated side effects that can happen, right? So we monitor post-approval. And I could give you an example of a class of agents called the COX-2 inhibitors. They're a kind of pain medicine. Celexa was one of them, where after approval, after phase 3, everything looked okay, but then we found several years later that people that took those specific agents, the COX-2 inhibitors like Celebrex, Celexa, had a higher risk for, I believe it was stroke and heart attack, and that was picked up through post surveillance or through post marketing surveillance research. All right, how are we doing on time? Okay, so where do we find information about the drugs that we use? Well, they're drug guides, little flip books, and I highly recommend everybody has a flip book, like an Infomed guide, the ACLS and critical care versions, really quick, easy information access. There's something called a PDR, physician desk reference, and basically what it is a big book that contains essentially what are known as package inserts. Now, package insert is a little insert that you open up, and it's a big page, and it has comprehensive information about a medication that comes in the package, that medication. There are various different guides out there. Hippocrates is a very common application that people use. It's free. You put it on a iOS or Android operating systems. Micromedics is one that's commonly used in the hospital, drug guide books. And the question is there a possibility for bias in all of these resources and references? And the answer is yes, there is a possibility. And I always want you all to remember this: the ultimate bias-free source for drug information in the United States is still the USP, or the United States Pharmacopoeia. Unfortunately, we don't have easy access to that. So we have to use these other sources to make our decisions. And obviously you would include clinical practice guidelines and protocols and scope of practice and medication guidelines is a part of that as well. All right. So some additional drug information, naming of drugs. This is important. All right. So there are several, a single drug will have several different names. First, there's what we call the chemical name, and this describes the chemical structure of a drug. This is not as helpful for us for the most part. And then there's something called the generic name. And the generic name is a name that is assigned by the USAN, or the United States Adopted Names, and it will always be in lowercase. For example, acetaminophen with a lowercase a is the generic name for a type of pain and fever relieving agent. Now, the trade name or the brand name will always be capitalized. And essentially the way it works is if you're a drug company and you put all the money and effort into getting a drug to market, you have a certain period of time where you have exclusive rights to manufacture that medication and make all the money you can. It's a certain number of years, right? You have a trademark. And so you get to call that drug whatever you want to call it, right? That is the trade name. For example, Tylenol, right? And only the company that originally developed Tylenol can call it that. And then when the trademark expires and the medication can be manufactured by any other drug company, they cannot call it Tylenol. They have to call it by its generic name, acetaminophen. It's the same chemicals, the same chemical structure, but it has to do with the company, right? The OG company, they get to call it by its trade name. That's the name that they can use. And then when the trademark expires and it becomes generic, and anybody can, as long as they meet FDA standards, can make that and market it. They cannot call it by its trade name. They have to call it by its generic name. And then the official name is what's in the United States Pharmacopoeia. So if you see a drug followed by USP, that tells you that is the official name. Oftentimes, the official name is the generic name. For example, diazepam USP is the official name for diazepam. And then the trade name for diazepam will be a capital V, Valium, right? All right. We talked about pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, all right, and indications and usage. So a drug has to be used for diseases that the FDA has approved, right? So drug goes through approval and the FDA says, okay, you can use a drug for this purpose, but there is some allowance for physicians primarily to, as we begin to understand more about drugs after they get to the market, maybe these drugs have effectiveness for different things, right? And so there's something called off-label use, where a drug is not officially approved to be used for something, but it is still used because it appears to be effective. And this is what's known as off-label use. Occasionally that happens. We try to avoid that if at all possible as EMS providers, of course, but it does happen. Okay. Oh, wow. It is already 10:30. So tell you all what, let me go ahead and get you all on a break. Any questions so far? All right. I'm going to get you all on a break. It's 10:30. I'll see you all at 10:45.
Hey, Chris, real quick.
Yes. Welcome back. Let's see, Joshua, I'll see what I can do for you there. I got your message there. All right.
Thank you.
No problem. All right. Well, we'll pick up where we left off and keep going on. We've got a fair amount of information I want to try to get through today, but we don't have lab to worry about, so we may go a little longer than we normally would. All right. So let me go back into share here. Make sure that pulls up. All right. So far, so good. Here we go. All right. So going into further into the drug profile. So contraindications. So contraindications are warnings concerning particular patients or certain situations where the drug should not be used. And there are two different kinds of contraindications. There are what we call absolute contraindications, where you absolutely cannot use this drug in this situation, versus relative contraindications, where you might consider using the drug, but you need to do a very robust risk-benefit analysis and do the benefits of using this drug outweigh the risks, right? So there are relative and there are absolute contraindications. Okay, so in addition to that, there are what we call interactions. Drugs can interact, and there are a few major kinds of interactions, all right? And the few that I want to discuss are what we call additive interactions, synergistic interactions, and potentiation. So additive is simply the sum of the effects of the two drugs given together is equal to the effects of them given separately. So for example, let's say I have a medication that lowers your heart rate by 1 beat per minute, and another medication that lowers your heart rate by 1 beat per minute. If I give both of those medications, the overall effect should be to lower your heart rate by 2 beats per minute. That seems like a silly example, but it's at least concrete and it gives you an idea for what that means, right? You could apply this to pain medication, right? Something that reduces pain, right? If you give the same one dose of one drug and a dose of another drug, and they have additive effects, the overall effect would be right of one drug plus one drug, right? So think of it as 1 + 1 = 2, right? Now, synergism is when you have two drugs given together results in a greater than anticipated effect. So let's say that drug A decreases heart rate by 1 beat per minute if you give it by itself. Drug B reduces heartbeat by 1 beat per minute if given by itself, but when given together, the overall effect is to decrease the heart rate by 10 beats per minute, right? So the overall effect is greater than the sum of the individual parts, right? That's what synergism is, and there are lots of synergistic reactions between medications. And then there's something called potentiation. Potentiation is where one drug that has no direct effect on whatever you're looking at is given with another drug that does, and then the overall response is greater than you would anticipate, right? And that's kind of like a 1 + 0 = 4. And where we see potentiation commonly is with sometimes with antiemetics. So if you give something like morphine, for example, which is for pain, and you give morphine with something like promethazine, which is an antiemetic, you can get potentiation where if you give promethazine by itself, it doesn't do anything for pain, right? It's not an analgesic, but when you give it with morphine, it potentiates the effects of the morphine, and the overall pain relief that you get increases, right? So you're giving a pain medicine with another medicine that doesn't have anything to do with pain, but when given together, the overall impact is increased, an increased effect. And that's called potentiation. All right, moving along. Other interactions. So adverse drug reactions. are unintended but often known, well-established side effects of a drug, right? And they may come and go away. They can be severe, life-threatening, and they can cause many different issues. Severe allergic reaction that involves bronchospasm, angioedema, airway compromise, hypotension, that's known as anaphylaxis, right? And obviously we treat that with epinephrine. And so if somebody says they are allergic to a medication, you need to figure out, did they have an adverse reaction? Or did they have a true allergic reaction? An allergic reaction is an immune-mediated response, right, through IgG, whereas an adverse reaction is just that, right? And so in a lot of cases, people don't know the difference. And so they, let's say that they took a medicine and it made them nauseous, right? Or gave them tremors. They may say that they're allergic to it. And then you kind of dig down further and it's like, oh, wait a minute, it gave you tremors. Well, you had an adverse reaction, not necessarily an allergy, right? So getting that specific information is very important. All right. Okay. So additional drug information, dosage and administration, right? Standard dosage for specific medications. How is it supplied? And is there any special treatment required to preserve its effectiveness, right? For example, some medications need to be kept out of the sunlight, right? Sunlight degrades them, and they are often contained in dark ampules or vials for that reason. How are they administered? Some have multiple routes of administration. Okay. So, method of administration is determined by many things: the rate of onset of drug activity and the individual physiochemical factors that affect drug absorption. We will talk about this in some detail with pharmacokinetics. But there is a very important concept that I want to front load here, and this is something called the first pass effect. And this applies to drugs that are absorbed enterally. Often this is drugs given orally. So a drug that is absorbed into the body enterally, when we say that you give something through an enteric route, that is a route where you have absorption of that drug occurring through the gastrointestinal mucosa. Typically, it's going to be the intestines. The reason that this is important is if a drug gets absorbed in your gut, okay, the blood from your intestines will go to the liver first before it goes into your central circulation. So any drug that goes in your gut, it's going to get absorbed and it's going to go into the portal circulation and it's going to go to the liver, which means that that drug will get metabolized before it goes into your central circulation. That's what we mean by first pass, is right. The first thing that happens to that drug is it goes to the liver and it undergoes metabolism, or what we call biotransformation. Those are synonymous terms when it comes to pharmacology. All right. Now, this can do a couple of things. This might deactivate some drugs or turn them into what are called inactive metabolites. So a metabolite is what happens after a drug gets metabolized, right? So some drugs may be deactivated. Other drugs may be converted into active metabolites, right? So a lot of us think, or a lot of you may have thought or may have been falsely taught that metabolism always deactivates a drug. That's not always the case, not at all, right? Some drugs are completely inactive until they are metabolized. I gave you the example of aspirin, right, during pathophysiology, right? Aspirin is a prodrug, a drug that requires metabolism to be, or biotransformation to be in its active form, right? Acetyl salicylic acid, the acetyl groups get cleaved off during metabolism, and the active metabolite salicylic acid is produced. Other drugs like heroin, right? Heroin is also a substance where it actually gets metabolized into morphine, right? So heroin, after you give it, is an inactive drug until it gets converted into morphine in the central nervous system. And then that's the active metabolite of heroin. Okay. And there are several other examples that we could think of as well. So liver enzymes may inactivate a portion of the drug prior to reaching the central circulation. Not always, but it may. So some drugs cannot be given orally, or if you give a drug orally through the enteral, or it has enteral absorption, insufficient concentrations of that drug will get into the central circulation due to the first pass effect, right? So some drugs cannot be given orally, like epinephrine, right? You cannot give somebody an epinephrine pill and have them take it and get the effects, because the epinephrine is metabolized in the gut by enzymes like monoamine oxidase, or MAO, right? So you have to give epinephrine either parenterally or out. The absorption has to occur outside of the GI tract. Typically, we would give it intramuscularly, or sometimes intravenously, or sometimes inhaled as well. All right. So the dosages may vary substantially. Some medications can be given orally, or what we call enterally, and they can be given parenterally. And oftentimes the IV dose is going to be different, or the IM dose, the parenteral dose, may be different than the enteral dose because of the first pass effect. So let's just talk about routes of administration. Enteral routes are routes where absorption occurs primarily via the GI tract. Oral tends to be the most common enteral route, but it could be nasogastric or oral gastric, or through a PEG tube. All right. Sometimes rectally, as a suppository or an enema, very occasionally. And then you have what are called parenteral routes. All right, where the absorption occurs outside of the GI tract. You bypass the first pass effect with parenteral routes, where the drug gets into the bloodstream first before going to the liver, right? And so this includes inhaled, injected, so IV, IM, IO, sub-Q, intradermal, topical absorption through like a patch, right? Like a fentanyl patch or a nitroglycerin patch. All right. Those would all be considered parenteral routes. So enteral routes, absorption through the GI tract; parenteral routes, absorption outside of the GI tract. All right. So let's move on to the next section, pharmacokinetics. So pharmacokinetics provides a mathematical basis to assess the time course of drugs and their potential effects on the body, right? So the drug moving into and out of the body, that's pharmacokinetics. What's the body doing to the drug, right? This helps determine how much do we give, what's the duration, the frequency of dosing, etc. All right. And ultimately, the effectiveness of any drug dosing really comes down to the concentration. You have to have sufficient concentrations of that drug at the site of the drug's action. So pharmacokinetics is broken up into 4 different phases, okay, or processes. And this is what we refer to as ADME, the ADME of pharmacokinetics. You have absorption. How does a drug get into your body? Distribution. How is the drug transported around throughout your body? Metabolism, also known as biotransformation. How is the drug changed and metabolized or biotransformed? And then elimination. How do we get rid of the drug and or the drug metabolites? All right. So pharmacokinetics is a process of a medication moving around into and out of the body. So it's what the body does to the medication. So let's just start at absorption. So prior to getting into your systemic system, a drug needs to be disintegrated dissolved and you need to get it into your central circulation. So disintegration is the first rate limiting step, right? And that makes sense. If you swallow, say, a pill, I swallow a tablet of aspirin, that aspirin needs to get disintegrated, and then it needs to pass through several membranes to get into the circulation, to go to the liver, to be metabolized, to get into the central circulation. However, if I give aspirin as an intravenous infusion, and believe it or not, there are countries in the world where aspirin is given that way, it's already in solution, right? It's dissolved in an IV solution, which means it's already disintegrated, right? It's already in solution. It doesn't need to be disintegrated. Therefore, it's going to tend to work more quickly after it gets into your body. So many different routes of absorption. We've talked about them already. Enteral versus parenteral. Inhalation and topical absorption are generally considered parenteral routes of absorption as well. All right, so injection of drugs into the muscles, subcutaneous to intradermal tissues are also routes, ways of getting a drug in. But the key point here is routes where you have immediate access to the central circulation, okay, is going to bypass the absorption process altogether. So intravenous injection, and you can include intraosseous as well. So IO/IV injections bypass absorption completely. If you give something intramuscular or subcutaneous, you still have some period of time, right? It has to get absorbed into the capillary networks of those tissues before the drug gets into your central circulation. So there's still going to be some delay, all right? But IV completely bypasses the absorption process. And the drug absorption really depends on whether the medication is given as a continuous infusion or as an intermittent bolus. In some drugs, what we have to do is we have to give a bolus of the medication, a large dose, to increase the concentration in the body rapidly, and then to maintain that therapeutic concentration, you will follow up with the continuous infusion. So something like lidocaine, for example, if you're going to use lidocaine as an antidysrhythmic to treat certain cardiac dysrhythmias, you will give a bolus of lidocaine, and sometimes you'll need to give multiple boluses to get the concentration up in the body, and then you will follow up with a drip, a continuous drip, to maintain that therapeutic concentration, okay? Other drugs, that's not how they work, right? If you're giving epinephrine for anaphylaxis, for example, you're going to give it IM typically, and then it'll absorb through the capillaries in the muscle. It'll go into your central circulation, and the body will clear it. So it'll have a fairly rapid onset and short duration of action, all right? So continuous infusions are gives a kind of a regulated, constant dosage of medication over time, and this keeps somebody in what's called steady state. And steady state is just a concept where the amount of medication coming into the body is equivalent to the medication going out, right? So absorption equals elimination. And there's a balance which keeps the concentration relatively stable. Now, if it's coming in faster than it's going out, then the concentration will increase. And if it's going out faster than it's coming in, the concentration will decrease. And so the goal in a lot of cases is to reach steady state. Okay. All right, keep moving along. So there is something called the therapeutic index, or the TI. It's a ratio. And essentially what it is it's a range of effectiveness, right? At what concentration is a medication effective? So here's right? So I get up to the concentration where it's effective. And then at what concentration is it toxic, right? And that difference is called the therapeutic index. And typically the narrower, the smaller the therapeutic index, the effective concentration and toxic concentration, the smaller that is, the less safe the drug is. So the safest drugs tend to have a very large therapeutic index, right? Where the difference between the effective concentration and the toxic concentration is very large, right? But other drugs very narrow. So for the risk of toxicity is very high in drugs that have a very narrow therapeutic index. Okay. Another important concept is something referred to as bioavailability. That's the amount of drug that actually gets into the bloodstream. This is important when it comes to first pass for enterally absorbed drugs, right? If you absorb a drug enterally, some percentage of that drug will get metabolized and eliminated, and it will not make it into the central circulation, right? And that's important to know, right? So for example, let's say that you give somebody 100 milligrams of a drug orally, but only 50 of that 100 milligrams makes it into the central circulation. What does that mean? Well, that means that that drug has a bioavailability of 50%. Only 50% of that drug will actually get into the central circulation. The other 50% gets metabolized and inactive metabolites and eliminated. All right. Now, if you give a medication IV or IO, bioavailability is 100%, right? Because every milligram or microgram of that medication is going to go into your central circulation. All right. So absorption is influenced by lots of different things. The drug solubility. How easy is it for that drug to dissolve and get into your blood? What's the form? Is it a tablet, a capsule? Is it a liquid that you're swallowing? Is it a sustained release tablet, which is enteric coated and takes a long time to dissolve, right? What route are you giving it, right? If you're giving something IV, right, the absorption is going to be very different than if you're giving it enterally. PO, for example, or by mouth, per os. pH plays an important role, right? And the different forms, is it more saltier, more ionic, or less ionic, more hydrophilic or more lipophilic? All right. So unless given by IV, a drug must cross several semi-permeable membranes before it gets into your central circulation. And remember, these membranes are semi-permeable. That is to say that large molecules tend not to go through them as easily. All right. And many drugs are large molecules. And so these cell membranes can act as barriers that inhibit the passage of the drug molecules into the cells and the systemic circulation, right? Remember, cell membranes are primarily a lipid matrix. It's a phospholipid bilayer, and it has selective permeability to it. In general, non-ionized drugs, that is to say lipophilic drugs, we talked about ionized versus non-ionized way back in pathophysiology. So that information we covered there is very relevant in pharmacology, tend to penetrate membranes better. So lipophilic drugs, fatty drugs, tend to penetrate cell membranes easier, whereas ionized drugs do not penetrate membranes as well, but rather they tend to dissolve in water very easily. So those are called hydrophilic. So you can have a very hydrophilic drug, which will go into your bloodstream, and it may want to stay in your bloodstream, right? But if it is not lipophilic, it may not leave your bloodstream, and maybe the site of action for that drug is in the brain, right? And it's going to be harder to get that drug into the brain because it is charged, so it won't get through those membranes. And so maybe you have to give a very large dose of that specific drug to get into sufficiently high concentrations in, say, the brain that you need, right? So you can see this is a lot of complex interplay of stuff going on here. All right, so just to review, Drugs can cross cell membranes through many different mechanisms, just simple passive diffusion. Specifically, if they're very small lipophilic, they're small and lipophilic, they tend to easily pass by just passive diffusion right through the cell membrane. Facilitated passive diffusion, right? So they're still diffusing passively, but there's a carrier protein that facilitates their movement, right? Something like insulin facilitating the movement of glucose into a cell. Active transport is moving actively using a pump or a channel. So you're actually having to use ATP or energy to move something, oftentimes against a concentration gradient. Ion channels, if a drug is ionic, and even penocytosis, which means drinking, right? The cells can kind of drink, and it's kind of a modification of phagocytosis. All right, so those are the major mechanisms. So drugs diffuse from a region of high concentration to low concentration, right? That's what diffusion is, right? And the diffusion rate depends on lots of things. What's the concentration gradient? If you have a very high concentration of a drug in your gut and a very low concentration of blood in your bloodstream, that's going to support increased diffusion, right? How lipid soluble is the drug? Is it going to pass through lipid membranes easily? How large is the drug? Very large drugs, much harder to get through membranes. How ionized is a drug? Highly charged, highly polar molecules might not get through cell membranes as easily unless there's a specific channel or receptor for them. And then the area of the absorptive surface, right? Is there a large surface area for absorption? All right, moving on. pH. We talked about what pH is. pH can impact absorption and diffusion substantially, because the pH in your GI tract changes quite a bit. In your stomach, you have a very low pH of right around 1 to 2. In your intestines, it's a little bit higher. It's still a little more on the acidic side, but it's like pH of 4 to 5. Most drugs are either weak organic acids, they have carboxyl groups in them, or they're weak bases, they have amine groups in them. And what happens is, if you put those drugs in a highly acidic or a highly basic environment, that is going to push hydrogen ions onto them or pull hydrogen ions off of those drugs. And it is going to ionize or deionize those drugs, right? So some drugs, are like aspirin, for example. Aspirin becomes less charged in an acidic environment. And so aspirin tends to dissolve better in, say, the pH, the low pH environments in your stomach or the upper part of your small intestine, right? Whereas aspirin does not absorb as effectively when the pH is higher, because that turns aspirin into its charged earth ionic form. And so one of the ways that we can help treat, say, someone's overdosed on aspirin is by making them alkalotic. We'll give them bicarbonate, we'll make them alkalotic, we'll make their urine alkalotic. And what happens is the high pH of the urine traps the aspirin or the salicylic acid molecules in there. And now they're very charged, so they can't get through the membranes as easily in the kidneys and go from the urine back into the circulation, and they get urinated off. That's called ion trapping behind a charged selective membrane, right? So that's just one example where pH can be very critical. You're on time. Okay, we're still good. All right. So the unionized form of a drug is usually lipid soluble and tends to cross cell membranes easily. The ionized form has low lipid solubility, but dissolves in water easier, right? So it's good at dissolving in your blood, but maybe not so good at getting out of your blood in passing into or out of other tissue compartments. All right. The proportion of an unionized form of a drug to its ionized form is determined by the pH and the drug's pKa. Remember the pKa from pathophysiology, the acid, it's the log of the Ka, the dissociation constant. And like we said, most drugs are either weak acids or weak bases, and the pH of the environment that that drug is in can really determine how effective it is. Let me give you another example. Does anyone know what we use lidocaine for?
As an intermediate, you give as a local anesthetic.
Give as an anesthetic, yeah, a local anesthetic. Has anyone ever had a really bad dental abscess, like an abscessed tooth? And do you remember how painful that was? And maybe do you remember going to the dentist and them having a difficult time getting your pain under control with lidocaine? That's typically what you get. A lot of people say Novocaine, but it's actually lidocaine is typically what's given. Or has anyone ever had or been around someone who's maybe had an infection, like an abscess in their skin, and it's just like, man, they're given the lidocaine and the patient's still having all this pain. What's going on there? Well, this is another example of pH playing an important role. In the area where you have an abscess, that's an infection, you've got lots of necrosis. So you have lots of what? Well, you have lots of cells that aren't working, and you have lots of anaerobic metabolism, which means you have lots of acid being produced. And so the pH in an infected area is very low. And the low pH tends to ionize lidocaine, which means that it is harder for the lidocaine molecules to penetrate into the nerves and block the sodium channel in the nerves. That's how lidocaine works. It's a sodium channel blocker. So that's why local anesthesia can be very difficult where you have abscesses in lots of low pH environment, like a dental abscess or say a skin abscess or something like that. Again, you can see just how important this concept is. All right. Facilitated passive diffusion, right? We talked about that with a protein can facilitate the movement of a molecule across the cell membrane if there's a carrier. All right, active transport. This tends to be very selective. It requires energy expenditure, may actually be transporting against concentration gradients. And this tends to be limited to drugs that have a chemical structure that's similar to substances in your body, like ions, vitamins, sugars, or amino acids. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll try to develop drugs that have a similar shape to, sugars or amino acids in our body, and because we know that the channels that uptake those particular substances might be able to uptake that drug. All right. And so these drugs tend to have very specific sites of absorption because of that. All right. Remember, ion channels in membranes are spanning proteins that penetrate through the entire cell membrane, can form pores, and can allow ions to rapidly transverse the membranes in some cases, right? Sodium channels, potassium channels are the two big ones we talk about, like the sodium potassium ATPase pump, but you've got calcium channels, chloride channels, magnesium, and so on. And these ion channels open and close, they're gated in response to particular stimuli or ions. So you can have what's called a charge, a voltage gated ion channel, where if the voltage changes inside or outside of the cell, that can cause a channel to open or close, right? You can have something called a ligand gated channel. And a ligand is just a molecule that attaches and activates or deactivates or agonizes or antagonizes the channel, right? So you've got voltage gated ion channels and you've got ligand gated ion channels. All right. Talked about pinocytosis already. Usually this is fairly large molecules, lots of energy is required. large, like protein-based drugs, for example. Okay, so moving on from there to distribution. So now we've got the drug in the central, the systemic circulation. We need to distribute it to where it needs to go. Distribution is typically very uneven. All right. You often think, okay, it's in the bloodstream, it just kind of dissolves and kind of just more or less diffuses out equally. No, it's very uneven, and it's due to areas of blood perfusion, the size of the drug, how lipophilic and lipophilic or hydrophilic the drug is, the pH of the environment, cell membrane permeability, right? All of that, there's a complex interplay into where is that drug actually going to go as it gets distributed, right? It's very uneven, but the major vehicle for distributing a drug throughout the body is the blood flow. The blood flow is the major vehicle for drug distribution. Right. We talked about the state entry rate equals exit rate, right? So that distribution plays a role in distribution, the distribution equilibrium, how much is coming in, that's going to play a role, obviously. And the blood flow, the hydrophobic or hydrophilic or lipophobic or lipophilic character of the drug, protein binding as well. Sometimes drugs will bind to proteins. So if a drug binds to a protein, say in your blood, like albumin, then that means that that drug molecule is unavailable to bind or to work at its site wherever it's supposed to work, right? Because it's bound to the protein. So protein binding also plays a role in drug distribution and ultimate availability. Okay. All right. You know what? I'm going to take a little break before I talk about the volume and distribution, because this is kind of can be a difficult concept to understand. So let's go ahead and take a little break. I have got, stop sharing there. I've got 11:22. So let's meet back up at 11:35. I'll pick up where we left off. So we're talking about something called the volume of distribution. So the volume distribution is an interesting concept. And essentially what it is it's a way of figuring out where is a drug going after it's given, right? And so it's not actually a quote unquote real value. It is a kind of a made up concept. And I'm going to try to explain it here. All right, see if everyone can see that. Okay, so the volume of distribution, or more appropriately, the apparent volume distribution, is simply how much drug is in the body divided by the plasma concentration of the blood. Remember, the only way we can really measure is by blood plasma, right? We can't measure inside of the cells. It's difficult to measure concentration specific organs and organ systems without damaging them. So really all we have is what is the concentration of the drug in the blood plasma. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the same concentration in a certain organ, right? That's just a blood plasma. So what we can do is we can develop this concept. And so the way that it works is if you give a drug and that drug distributes evenly throughout your body. So let's say that you have even distribution. You would expect it to distribute approximately 40 liters, right? Why is that? Well, that's about how much body water an average person has, 42 liters. So if you calculate, you give 100 milligrams of a drug, and then you find out what the concentration is in the plasma, and you divide the amount in body by plasma, and you get a value of about 40, what that means is that that drug is more or less evenly distributed throughout all of the water in your body. However, if you get a very large number, say 1,000 liters. Now, we don't actually have 1,000 liters of water in our body, right? That's impossible. So what this is saying is that the concentration of that drug in your plasma is so low. The concentration in the plasma is so low that it's like that drug has been dissolved in 1,000 liters. Not literally dissolved in 1,000 liters, but it's like it has been dissolved in 1,000 liters, right? So what does that mean? Well, that just means that the drug's not in your blood plasma. That means whatever drug, you know it's in the body somewhere, it's not in the blood, it's not dissolved in your body water, it is dissolved in some other area of the body. Typically, that is going to be the fat. So the higher the volume of distribution, the more likely a drug is to go into fatty compartments. The lower you go, the more likely that drug is to stay within your water compartments, right? And if you have a volume of distribution around, 2 to 3 liters, well, that is a drug that is contained primarily in the vascular compartment, right? Because that's about how much water you have in your intravascular compartment, 2 to 3 liters, right? So 2 to 3 liters would be in the vascular compartment. 40 liters would be more or less evenly distributed throughout all the tissues in the body. And then greater than that is more and more sequestered in fatty compartments, right? So that's what that particular value, that particular concept's actually telling us, is what compartment is this drug going into? All right, so we'll go back to the power here and carry on. All right. So that's what volume distribution is. All right. All right, so let's move on to metabolism or biotransformation. So metabolism, and we talked about this, in a general sense, it's a sum of all chemical reactions in the body. But in pharmacology, a lot of people tend to get away from the term metabolism because it means something in physiology and something else in pharmacology. So a lot of people use the term biotransformation in place of metabolism. It basically, biotransformation is just a word that means drug metabolism. I will use both terms interchangeably here. Important points here. The primary area of metabolism in your body is the liver. In fact, there is a large enzyme system within your liver that contains many different types of enzymes known as the cytochrome P450 system. And approximately 90% of all drugs are metabolized in part through this system, all right? And these enzymes can be induced, which means their activity increases, or they can be inhibited, which means their activity decreases. And that can be genetic, or that can be due to drug interactions, and so on. So before a drug can be excreted or eliminated, it tends to need to be metabolized. And so the goal of metabolism from the body standpoint is to make drugs more water soluble. All right. That's why the body metabolizes drugs, to make it more water soluble, because if it is water soluble, then it wants to stay in the urine. It goes to the urine and you can eliminate it through the urine. All right. However, some metabolites have pharmacological action. We call those active metabolites. Other metabolites are inactive, and we call those inactive metabolites. All right. So two general types of metabolism, right? Breaking things down, building things up. And anytime a drug gets changed through an enzyme system like the cytochrome P450 or CYP450 system, it has been metabolized, and the new molecule is what we call a metabolite. All right. And I talked about prodrugs, right? Like heroin. Heroin is a prodrug. It is inactive, and then it gets metabolized into its active form. It's diacetylmorphine. And then once it goes into your brain, those acetyl groups get cleaved off and it gets converted into morphine. Aspirin is another example of a prodrug. So there's several examples there. All right. So enzymes play a critical role in biotransformation. And enzymes are proteins that make chemical reactions occur more efficiently. That's called catalysis. And they do this by decreasing the activation energy. And we talked about this in pathophysiology. So here you have on the top here, you have a chemical reaction without an enzyme, and you have a very large activation energy, or a very large delta E here, right? And then with the enzyme present, the activation energy is much lower, so that chemical reaction can occur more efficiently, right? That's catalysis. All right. So continuing talking about metabolism, there are two major phases of metabolism. And to make it more complicated, a drug doesn't necessarily need to go through both phases. Some drugs just go through phase one. Others will go through both phase one and phase two. All right. So phase one biotransformation is small modifications where you essentially add or unmask, you take atoms off of a molecule and you unmask little chemical groups. Typically, these are going to be hydroxyl alcohol groups, and this is done through oxidation, reduction, and hydrolytic reactions. So basically, you're unmasking or adding hydroxyl groups in order to make the resultant molecule or the metabolite a little more water soluble, right? And this is extensively what's done with the CYP450 or the cytochrome P450 enzymes, right? The type 2 or phase 2 biotransformation involves attaching a large, typically water-soluble molecule to the metabolite. So phase 1 it involves attaching small molecules or taking small chunks off to make it more water-soluble. And in phase 2, you're attaching large, like sugar molecules to it. And that's called glucuronidation. All right. That's or large sulfur-based molecules. That's called sulfation, and so on and so forth. And you're making the metabolite larger and more likely to stay in the water. All right. So this is just a diagram. You don't have to remember this, but over here on the left side, you have your lipophilic drug. All right, so here's your drug, and it can either be oxidized or reduced through hydrolysis, right? And you're adding oxygen containing groups to it, right? And then in phase 2, you're adding large, like you're conjugating it with like glutathione, sulfation, you're adding acetyl groups, or you're adding large sugars through glucuronidation, right? And you're starting off with a drug that is more lipophilic, and you're ending with a metabolite that is more hydrophilic, so you can eliminate it. All right. So the rate of metabolism varies among people, right? Some people may rapidly metabolize a drug, others may not. And this is not as intuitive as you might think, right? There are some instances where rapid metabolism can increase the risk of toxicity, not decrease. For example, codeine. Codeine is a prodrug. Codeine gets converted into morphine. It's methylmorphine is codeine, and the methyl group gets cleaved off. So what you can have happen is if you have a rapid metabolizer for codeine, if you give somebody a standard dose of codeine, and they metabolize that codeine very rapidly, they may be at risk for overdose because more of that codeine will get metabolized to morphine than normal, right? Whereas you might have an ultra slow metabolizer, which can't metabolize as much codeine into its active form, so codeine is not effective for them. In other cases, a rapid metabolizer may deactivate a drug, may make inactive metabolites more efficiently, right? So it kind of varies. Genetic factors, coexisting factors, a big one is liver disease, right? Chronic liver disease, heart failure. These are things that tend to make metabolism less effective. And then different drug interactions. Some drugs can suppress enzymes or activate, right? Inhibit or enhance enzyme activity, right? Phenobarbital is notorious for a drug that interacts with different enzyme systems to either induce their activity or inhibit their activity. All right, and then finally, elimination, right? The primary way we eliminate is through the kidneys. So primary source of metabolism is the liver, primary source of elimination is the kidneys, right? So hepatic metabolism makes the drug more polar, so it stays in water, and then the kidneys get rid of it. That's like the high 30,000-foot view of metabolism and elimination, right? So kidney function, right, is going to impact your ability to eliminate drugs and their metabolites. All right, so impaired renal function can prolong drug effects due to ineffective elimination, right? So this together gives rise to another concept that I want to talk about, and this is called the half-life. So once a drug is absorbed, typically what about 90% of drugs do, the way that they work is they interact with receptors. So most of the drugs that we administer, with the exception of electrolyte solutions, and even there is some wiggle room, but most drugs interact with some biological receptor, all right? So once it is absorbed and distributed, its active form, whatever that may be, its original form or some active metabolite will interact with the receptor, and that's the pharmacodynamics of a drug. But it's important to know how long that drug will remain in the body, and this is where the concept of a half-life, or what we call elimination kinetics. And there are two major models for the elimination kinetics of drugs or their metabolites. There's something called zero order elimination. This tends to be fairly rare. In zero order elimination is where you have a constant rate of drug elimination. So it doesn't matter how much drug you have in your body, the rate at which that drug is eliminated is constant. All right, that's called zero order kinetics. So it's a straight line. So elimination would be a straight line if you were to graph it. Now I'm going to give you some examples of graphs. That's generally not how drugs are eliminated, because the higher the concentration, the more likely that drug is to come into contact with an enzyme and be metabolized and eliminated, right? Now, eventually what happens is you can get to such a high dose or such a high concentration in your body that all the enzymes are fully saturated. And once that happens, then the rate of elimination is constant. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much more drug you give, all the enzymes are saturated. And that saturation can be at very high or very low concentration. For example, alcohol, ethanol, drinking alcohol has a very low concentration for saturation. So our ethanol is primarily has zero order elimination kinetics, right? Whereas many other drugs have what's known as first order elimination kinetics. And first order elimination kinetics is the higher the concentration, the faster it's metabolized. And then as the concentration decreases, the rate of metabolism and elimination ultimately what we're talking about, will slow down, right? It will not remain constant. And the dosing frequency depends heavily on a drug's half-life. All right, so here are some graphs to demonstrate that. So zero order kinetics, right? So here you have concentration as a function of time, right? So over time, you have a constant rate. So the slope of this line here, the slope of that line is constant. It doesn't change. That's zero order elimination. Whereas first order elimination, the higher the concentration, the more rapid the elimination. Let me move this. So at a high concentration, the slope is very steep. And then as the concentration decreases, the slope becomes more and more shallow, right? So that is first order elimination. And this situation here is where the concept of half-life comes into play. So let's do a quick half-life exercise. So you administer 100 milligrams of a drug, and it has a bioavailability of 0.8 and a T1/2, that means half-life of 1 hour. So what this means is you administer 100 milligrams of a drug and 80 milligrams, right? The bioavailability is 0.8 or 80%. 80 of that 100 milligrams is in the central circulation now. So how many milligrams will remain in the body after 1 hour? Let me ask you all that question. How many milligrams after 1 hour?
40.
40, right? Or half. Easy. So how much is initially absorbed? Well, 80 milligrams. How much remains after 1 hour? 40 milligrams. So that means that after 2 hours or 2 half-lives, I should have 0 milligrams remaining. Is that correct?
Yes.
You would think so, right?
Would it be 20?
There you go. Remember, as the concentration decreases, this is first order elimination kinetics. As the concentration decreases, the rate of elimination is going to decrease. So the way that the half-life works is it's a half of a half of a half of a half. So after 1 half-life, I will have half remaining. After 2 half-lives, I'll have half of that half. So we have 80 milligrams initially, 40 milligrams after 1 hour, which means we would have 20 milligrams after 2 hours or 2 half-lives, right? Half of a half. And that would also mean that we would have, so we'd have 80, 40, 20, 10 milligrams after 3 hours, 3 half-lives, 5 milligrams after 4 half-lives. So remember, it's exponential decay. So it's half of a half of a half. So don't let that fool you if you run into a half-life problem, right? Now, liver disease and kidney disease can increase the half-life of some drugs, and this can cause prolonged and greater than expected effects. All right. So we may need to change the dose or the frequency. All right. Ooh, so finally made it through pharmacokinetics, and we're on to pharmacodynamics. So pharmacodynamics, again, is what the drug does to the body, right? So once it's absorbed, the drug has some action. Most of the time, it's going to involve a receptor, all right? All right, so there are some terms you need to be familiar with. There is what we call selectivity. So selectivity is the extent to which a drug acts on a specific site or receptor. Some drugs are highly selective to certain receptors. For example, albuterol is selective to the beta-2 receptor, whereas epinephrine is highly non-selective. It will get the beta 2, it'll get the alpha 1, it'll get the alpha 2, it'll get the beta 1, it'll get the beta 2. It's highly non-selective to adrenergic receptors, whereas albuterol is highly selective to a receptor. All right. And these receptors are important because they are involved in chemical signaling between and within cells. So they're located on the surface of the cell, within the cell, and oftentimes an activation of a receptor will cause the creation of a molecule within the cell called a secondary messenger that goes on to have secondary intracellular effects. All right, so upon binding to a receptor, the drug will produce a particular effect, and the drug receptor binding can cause lots of things. It can open or close an ion channel. For example, lidocaine blocks sodium channels and prevents neurons from depolarizing, right? Whereas another medication like benzodiazepines help keep certain channels, chloride channels in the brain open. Activation of biochemical messengers that initiate further chemical reactions, right? And normal cell can get turned on or turned off as a result of this, basically, very roughly speaking. So there is what's known as lock and key analogy. This is not perfect, all right? But it at least gives us some foundation for understanding how this works. So specific drugs have a characteristic shape. Remember, proteins also have a specific shape, a conformation, right? And receptors are proteins. So shape is important here. The shape will allow the drug to interact with a receptor in a certain way. If a drug fits the receptor and it activates or turns the receptor on, okay, you can think of that as a key going into the lock and interacting with the lock. You're locking it or unlocking it. You're locking the receptor, you're turning it off, or you're unlocking the receptor, you're turning it on. All right. And locking a receptor and preventing it from working is what we call antagonism. And turning a receptor on is what we call agonism. So agonists agonize, they activate. Antagonists antagonize, they deactivate. All right. And this, right, the drug, genetic mutations, aging, right, all of that plays a role into how effectively a drug can do this, right? So this is the lock key analogy here, right? The key is the drug and the lock is the receptor. There are two general types of receptors, or what we call ionotropic receptors. And these are ion channels. And when they are activated, they allow ions to flow into or out of cells, right? For example, benzodiazepines, right, interact with what are called GABA receptors, and they help with chloride ions. They help make the flow of chloride ions into the neurons more efficient, and that hyperpolarizes the neurons and makes them less likely to depolarize, and so that causes central nervous system depression. The other major type of receptor is what we call a metabotropic. And a metabotropic receptor, when it is activated, that receptor is bound to other proteins inside of the cell, right? And when that receptor gets activated, it activates these other proteins and it produces secondary messenger molecules. These are called metabotropic receptors, right? And the biggest category of them are something known as the TM7 or the transmembrane 7 receptors. And that's because the receptor loops in and out of the cell membrane 7 times, right? There's several loops that go in and out of the receptor. So these receptors are actually really complicated. For example, albuterol activates beta-2 receptors, and beta-2 receptors are a type of metabotropic, a type of transmembrane 7 receptor known as a G protein coupled receptor. So you've got the receptor, and then it is coupled to a G protein inside of the cell. And then when that receptor gets activated, it acts on the G proteins, and then the G proteins act on another protein. In the case of albuterol, it's adenyl cyclase, and then the adenyl cyclase gets turned on, and it causes ATP to be converted into CAMP, and it is the CAMP that acts as that secondary messenger. So you can see it's a complex interplay of things. So I think of ionotropic as just a simple movement of ions, whereas I think of metabotropic receptors as involving complex metabolism that makes secondary messengers. All right. We've already talked about racemic in chirality, right versus left. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking about that, because we talked about that, last week in pathophysiology. We talked about isomers, right? D versus L, dextrorotary versus levorotary. So here is actually, this is an example of albuterol. So this is a racemic mixture of albuterol, where I have right and left-handed forms of the molecule. They're just mirror images of one another. And remember, albuterol is a racemic mixture. Racemic just means 50% right-handed and 50% left-handed drug molecules. Right? Here we got albuterol. Mixes a racemic mixture. Right? And Xopenex is the R concentrated. So you essentially eliminate the S and you concentrate the R, and that's known as levoalbuterol or Xopenex. All right, we've talked about that already. So yeah, we've talked about glucose as well, right? D versus L glucose. And I won't spend any more time talking about that there. Okay, so some new concepts. Agonists versus antagonists. So agonists activate. Think of it that way. They activate. They have high affinity for the receptor and they activate. Antagonists prevent activation. All right, they antagonize the action of the specific receptor. That gives rise to a new set of concepts, potency versus efficacy. So what's the difference? Well, potency is how much drug do I have to give to produce a desired effect? All right, that is potency. Efficacy is what is the maximum effect a drug will produce. And whatever the ceiling is, whatever that maximum effect is, it will not go any further. And it doesn't matter how much more drug I give. I can keep giving the drug, but eventually I will get to the maximum effect, and I can keep giving more and more drug, but the effect does not increase. That is what we call the efficacy. The efficacy is the concentration of the dose required for the maximum effect. And we graph this in something called a dose response curve, right? So the lower the dose required to produce a certain effect, the more potent the drug is. So here are some drawings that I've done of graphs demonstrating potency versus efficacy. So here I've got drug A versus drug B. So on the x-axis, this is the dose, the concentration, and on the y-axis, this is response. It could be pain, it could be heart rate, it could be blood pressure, whatever response we're looking at. So if we graph drug A here and drug B, we see something. We notice that drug A is more potent, right? So at a lower dose, I'm getting effects, right? So this is the dose here, and this is the response. So at a lower dose, I'm getting a response, whereas to get the same response with drug B, I need a higher dose. I drop that down, right? So the dose is higher here. However, both drugs flatten out at the same response. So even though drug A has more potency, The efficacy of both drugs, the maximum effect that these drugs will produce is the same. See how they, right? They level off there. They have a ceiling. So both drugs have the same maximum effect. So drug A is more potent, but the efficacy is the same. However, over here, I have a situation where drug A is not only more potent, but it is has less efficacy. So even though drug A is more potent than drug B, its maximum effect levels off much lower than the maximum effect or response of drug B. So drug A is more potent, but it has a lower efficacy, whereas drug B is less potent, but has a higher efficacy. Its maximum effect is much higher than drug A. All right. And then here is a situation where, again, drug A is more potent than drug B, and drug A has more efficacy, right? So it levels off at a higher response than drug B. So in this situation, it is both more potent and it has more efficacy than drug B. Over here, it is more potent, but it has less efficacy. And then here it is more potent, but it has the same efficacy. So that's the difference between drug potency and drug efficacy. All right, moving right along. We're getting toward the end here, I promise. Tolerance is a decrease in patient's susceptibility to the drug's effect, typically due to continued use. And oftentimes this is due to what's known as downregulation. You have changes in the receptors, and you need a higher concentration to activate those receptors. So you have receptor changes. Sometimes receptors go away. The body will decrease the number of receptors. The receptors can degrade, or some enzymes can be turned off. And this tolerance ultimately means you might need to increase the drug dose to obtain the desired therapeutic response. All right. And there's also something called desensitization, which is a decrease in response to further stimulation due to prolonged exposure. So it's a very similar concept to the tolerance, where you get that downregulation. And drug dependency, this is a big part of drug dependency, right? Desensitization, downregulation, and tolerance, and needing to give more and more and higher doses to get a similar effect. All right, getting there. The next thing is therapeutic index. I've mentioned that earlier, right? That's talking about the safety of a med. It's the difference between the effectiveness and the toxicity, and the narrower that gets, the more unsafe that drug is, right? The more problematic it is. And then the wider it gets, the safer the drug is, right? All right, almost there. So prescription orders. So do we as paramedics have to have a prescription to administer medications? What do you all think? No, we don't.
Negative.
Yes,
Yes,
because of the
Yes, we
medical
do.
director.
we do. Right? You always have to have a prescription to administer medication. It's just that in many cases, we have a very special kind of prescription. And we have a prescription in the form of what's known as a protocol or a clinical practice guideline. That is still a prescription, and it is still signed off by a physician, right? So yes, we do need a prescription. It's just the type of prescription, right, is different, right? And then there are also direct prescription, like online medical orders, and offline medical orders, online or offline prescriptions. So the components of a proper medication order include the following. The drug name needs to be there, the dose, the route, how often it's given, or the frequency / schedule, and the physician's signature, right? Those need to be present for us to have a valid prescription. And this gives rise to the absolute critical rights of medication administration. And these must always be verified prior to administering a medication to a patient. Are we giving the patient the right medication? Are we giving it at the right time? Are we giving the right dose? Are we giving it through the right route? Are we giving the right concentration? Are we giving it to the right patient? And are we doing the right documentation before and after giving a medication? All right, so these are the critical rights of medication. The right med, the right time, the right dose, the right route, the right concentration, the right patient, and the right documentation. Absolutely critical. And errors here happen all the time, unfortunately, right? Even to this day, people are still getting the wrong concentration of epinephrine. People are still getting epinephrine 1 to 1,000 or 1 milligram per milliliter given IV. Still happens to this very day, and it still results in severe morbidity and even mortality in some people. Right? So these are absolutely critical to understand. All right. One of the last things I want to talk about are proper abbreviations. All right. And I'm going to be kind of harsh with you all on this, right? So when in doubt, write it out in plain English, right? When in doubt, if you're not sure if an abbreviation is proper or not, just write it out, okay? But things like U for unit or IU for international unit, no longer recommended. Just write it out, write unit or international unit, right? Things like QD, QOD, right? Every day or every other day, not recommended. Just write out every day, twice a day, 3 times a day, okay? Now, a lack of leading zero. This is a big one, all right? So if you're giving a decimal, you're giving a fraction of a medication, right? If you're going to give 0.5 milligram, you do not write 0.5 milligrams or 0.8 milligrams or 0.1 milligrams. That is not correct. You need to put a 0 in front of that, a leading 0. 0.4 milligrams, right? So give nitroglycerin 0.4 milligrams sublingually every 3 to 5 minutes as needed for chest discomfort, right? So you never have a decimal by its place. On the other hand, you never put a trailing 0, right? If you want to give 4 milligrams of morphine to somebody, you would never write 4.0. You just write 4, right? So there are no trailing zeros, but you always have a leading 0, right? 0 point, right? That's really big. All right. And then another thing that I want to mention is a pregnancy category as part of the contraindications. So essentially what this is the general risk to the fetus, how what we call teratogenic a medication is. So teratogenic is causing harm to the developing fetus. And there are several categories. So category A are the safest drugs, right? There's good evidence that these drugs do not pose a risk to the fetus. Category B drugs tend to be very safe, right? There is no evidence in animal or human studies, okay? Or well-controlled studies. Whereas in category A, there is great evidence. We've done studies and there's no risk. Whereas in category B, we haven't identified any problems, but there are no studies that show a lack of problems. Categories C and D are where most of our drugs come into play. And in categories C and D, there is varying degrees of evidence that suggest that a drug may be teratogenic. Category C is more animal studies, whereas category D actually has some human studies. And then finally, category X is absolute contraindication. A drug in category X is absolutely contraindicated for the pregnant patient or the potentially pregnant patient. All right, we talked about the major regulatory agencies already, the FDA versus the DEA. The BATF doesn't tend to impact us. It's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. But alcohol, ethanol containing substances might, but primarily the FDA and the DEA impact us, either law enforcement or regulatory. All right, we've already talked about controlled substances, but I'll just mention them. You have 5 schedules, and this is a federal level. This is the 1970, right? So Schedule 1 substances have a high abuse potential and no recognized medical use. So these include things like LSD, marijuana, peyote, heroin, etc. And then Schedule 2, 3, 4, and 5 substances have medical use, so they can be prescribed, but the abuse potential differs. So a category of Schedule 2 has a high abuse potential, but therapeutic benefit. So that include things like opium, morphine, fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine. We do still use cocaine, believe it or not, for maxillofacial procedures for anesthesia, and it's good at preventing bleeding, right? Then Schedule 3 has less abuse potential. So we say like a moderate to low physical dependence potential, right? And then Schedule 4, a low potential for abuse, and then Schedule 5 has the lowest potential. These tend to be like cough syrup that has very low doses of something like codeine in them. All right, we already talked about that, and that's it for now. We made it through. I know this was a monster lecture, so I'm sorry about that, but we got through it. So I'll let you all go. Are there any questions?
Sir.
All right. I know everyone's probably pretty tired,
Chris, I
so
had a question.
I'll let you all go. Yes.
So a couple of the quizzes that you had up this morning, I guess were due at 8 o'clock this morning. I don't know if that's an error or if we were supposed to get them done or what's up with that.
No. They should be due by midnight. Someone else sent me a message. So I'll go in and check on that. Yeah, they should be due by midnight tonight. So
Okay.
just give me,
All right.
yeah, give me a couple minutes to see what the issue is, and I'll get that sorted out for y'all.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay, no problem. Not an issue. All right. Any other questions? All right.
Sure. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's wrap this thing up. I'll get you guys off. And I'll see you in the morning.